Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. What would you do if someone destroyed your dream with cement and arrogance? For John, a quiet suburban homeowner, his hard-earned backyard oasis became the battleground of an outrageous HOA power play. When a self-appointed dictator named Karen claimed authority over his land, John vowed to fight back. And he wasn't alone. John had always been a man of vision and persistence. 10 years ago, he purchased a modest, aging house nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was far from perfect. It had peeling paint, a crumbling driveway, and an overgrown backyard, but John saw potential. Over the years, he transformed it into a home that reflected his hard work and dreams. He added a spacious garage, built a sturdy backyard shed, installed a cozy patio with string lights, and even excavated a basement to use as his private workshop. The crowning jewel of his renovation journey, however, was his long-awaited swimming pool. For years, John had dreamed of lounging by the water, hosting poolside barbecues, and watching his kids splash around on summer afternoons. After meticulous planning, he began construction on the pool, working with a reputable company to ensure everything was done perfectly. For 2 months, he watched his vision come to life, brick by brick, tile by tile, until finally the shimmering blue water sparkled in his backyard. The completion of the pool felt like a triumph, not just for John, but for the entire family. To celebrate, he hosted a lively neighborhood barbecue. He invited everyone, families with children, the young couple who had just moved in down the street, and his elderly neighbor Mary, who had been a constant source of kindness. Mary was practically part of the family, always looking out for their home when they were away. The barbecue was a roaring success, filled with laughter, the sizzle of grilling meat, and the joyous sound of children playing by the pool. John felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he looked around and saw how much happiness his hard work had brought. The neighborhood itself was one of the reasons John cherished his home so deeply. It was quiet and peaceful, with friendly neighbors who minded their own business, but were always ready to lend a helping hand. Most of the homes were privately owned and not subject to the rules of any homeowners association, HOA, which suited John perfectly. He valued his independence and had no desire to answer to an external authority about how he chose to live or maintain his property. As he settled into this new chapter of enjoying his dream pool, John couldn't have imagined that the calm, idyllic life he had built would soon be disrupted. But beneath the surface of this serene neighborhood lay a power struggle he was about to be dragged into, one that would test his resilience and threaten everything he had worked for. For now, though, the water in his new pool shimmered in the late afternoon sun, a symbol of years of hard work and the promise of peaceful days ahead. The weekend was supposed to be a carefree celebration. John and his family had packed up early that morning to attend a close friend's birthday party in a neighboring town. They left their home feeling secure, knowing that Mary, their trusted neighbor, would keep an eye on things. Mary had always been a dependable friend to the family, feeding their cat, watering their plants, and keeping a watchful eye over the property whenever they were away. But that afternoon, her call shattered John's sense of security. John's phone buzzed during the party, and he saw Mary's name flashing on the screen. Answering with a smile, his expression quickly changed as Mary's panicked voice came through. "John, you need to come back. There's a group of workers in your backyard with a bulldozer," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "What? What are they doing there?" John asked, his mind racing. "There's a woman with them. She said her name is Karen, and she's claiming she's the president of the HOA. She's saying your pool violates their rules and that they're authorized to remove it." "John, they've already started." John could barely process the words. He was furious and confused. His house wasn't part of any HOA, that much he was certain of. Promising Mary he'd head back immediately, he grabbed his family, excused himself from the party, and began the tense drive home. As he approached his house, his heart sank. From a distance, he could see the hulking machinery in his backyard and a group of workers carrying buckets and tools. Dust and noise filled the air. Mary was standing near his driveway, visibly upset, her hands clutching her phone tightly. She hurried over as John stepped out of his car. "I tried to stop them," she said, her voice breaking. "I even called the police, but when they arrived, Karen showed them some documents. She claimed you were part of the HOA and that this was authorized. The police left without doing anything." John turned toward the backyard, anger building with every step. Karen, a sharply dressed woman in her 40s with an air of authority, stood near the workers, gesturing at them as though she were orchestrating a grand operation. She spotted John and strode over, clipboard in hand, her expression smug and unyielding. "Are you John?" she asked in a clipped tone, barely waiting for his response. "I'm Karen, the president of the neighborhood HOA. I've been monitoring your property, and your pool violates our regulations. You didn't seek HOA approval before building it, and it's positioned improperly. We've had no choice but to take action." John's jaw tightened. "First of all, I'm not a part of your HOA. My property has never been under its jurisdiction. Second, this is my private land. You have no right to do anything here." Karen smirked. "That's where you're wrong. Your property was annexed into the HOA last year. We have all the documents to prove it, and frankly, you should have known better than to build without approval. This pool is a blight on our community, and I'm ensuring it's dealt with properly." As if to punctuate her words, John heard the sickening sound of concrete being poured. He rushed to the backyard, his heart sinking at the sight of his pool being filled with wet cement. The workers moved efficiently, ignoring his demands to stop. "Stop this immediately," John shouted. "You're trespassing, and you're destroying my property. I'll sue every last one of you." Karen crossed her arms and raised her eyebrows. "You're welcome to take it up with our legal team, but for now, the decision has been made. This is the consequence of ignoring HOA rules." John's protests were met with shrugs and indifference. Karen handed him a stack of papers, her smugness unshaken. "This is everything you'll need if you'd like to appeal, but good luck with that. We've dealt with situations like this before." As the workers finished their job, John stood in his backyard, staring at what was left of his beloved pool. The area that had been his dream now resembled a construction site, filled with wet cement and the debris of what had once been a place of joy. Mary approached him quietly, her voice soft but determined. "I recorded everything on my phone," she said, "from the moment they showed up to when the police left. You'll need this." John looked at her, his jaw clenched. "Thank you, Mary. I'm going to make sure they pay for this, every last one of them." As Karen and her crew left the property, John's determination solidified. What had started as an idyllic weekend had turned into a nightmare, but this was far from over. The morning after the chaos, John sat at his kitchen table staring at the stack of papers Karen had thrust into his hands. He hadn't had the chance to examine them the day before, but now, fueled by anger and determination, he pored over every page. What he found only deepened his fury. The documents claimed that his property had been annexed into the HOA 6 months earlier and included a list of supposed violations related to the construction of his pool. It didn't take long for inconsistencies to jump out. The address listed on the annexation papers wasn't even his. It belonged to a house on the other side of town. Furthermore, the notice of violation and order for demolition documents were riddled with vague language and lacked any signatures from John. It was as if Karen had simply assumed he'd never check or fight back. To make matters worse, John checked his mailbox and found it stuffed with unopened envelopes, all stamped with the HOA logo. He ripped them open, one after another, his frustration mounting. Each letter was a notification of fines: $500 for unauthorized construction, $1,000 for failure to comply with HOA requests, and even $2,000 for refusal to attend HOA meetings. By the time he tallied the total, it exceeded $10,000. But the most outrageous detail was that the demolition order, Karen's supposed justification for filling his pool with cement, had been addressed to an entirely different property owner. The HOA hadn't even bothered to ensure they had the right recipient. This was not just negligence, it was outright fraud. John felt a bitter mix of disbelief and resolve as he pieced the situation together. Karen and her HOA had fabricated an entire narrative to justify their actions. They had assumed he would quietly pay the fines or submit to their authority, but John wasn't about to let them off so easily. He called Mary, who came over with her phone to show him the videos she had recorded. "You're not going to believe this," John told her, showing her the documents. Mary shook her head in disbelief. "They didn't even bother to cover their tracks," she said. "This is as sloppy as it gets. You need to take this to someone who can help you fight back." John agreed. That afternoon, he contacted an attorney specializing in property law and laid out everything. The forged documents, the misaddressed notices, the outrageous fines, and the destruction of his pool. The attorney, a sharp and seasoned litigator named Rachel, reviewed the evidence and didn't mince words. "This is one of the most blatant abuses of power I've ever seen," Rachel said. "Not only is the HOA operating outside its jurisdiction, but they've committed multiple legal violations, fraud, destruction of private property, and likely even forgery. We have a strong case here." As they prepared to challenge the HOA, John couldn't shake the bitter irony of the situation. What was supposed to be his dream property had turned into a battleground. But with every piece of evidence he uncovered, his determination grew. If Karen and her HOA thought they could bully him into submission, they were about to learn they had picked the wrong target. As John and his attorney Rachel began building their case, Karen and the HOA doubled down on their efforts to intimidate him. Within days, new letters began flooding his mailbox, each one more hostile than the last. The fines now included late fees, ballooning the total owed to nearly $15,000. The letters demanded immediate payment and threatened legal action if he failed to comply. The situation grew worse when John started hearing whispers from his neighbors. Karen had been spreading rumors, claiming that John was a defiant troublemaker who refused to respect community rules. She painted him as someone who selfishly disregarded the neighborhood's aesthetic standards, tarnishing its reputation. Neighbors who once smiled and waved now seemed wary or avoided him altogether. One evening, as John was working in his garage, he overheard a conversation between two neighbors walking by. "I heard he built that pool illegally and refused to tear it down," one said. "I can't believe he's dragging our community through this," the other replied. The frustration and isolation mounted, but John refused to let Karen's manipulations break him. Determined to expose the truth, he dug deeper into the HOA's activities with Rachel's guidance. They discovered troubling patterns. Karen had a history of targeting homeowners who resisted the HOA's authority. She manipulated rules, issued excessive fines, and even threatened foreclosures, all without proper justification. Rachel encouraged John to reach out to other homeowners. He hesitated, uncertain if anyone would be willing to stand up against Karen, but his persistence paid off. A few brave neighbors, tired of Karen's tyranny, agreed to share their stories. One neighbor revealed how Karen had imposed fines for minor landscaping violations, while another recounted threats for parking a family RV in their driveway. Meanwhile, Mary's video footage of the pool demolition began circulating quietly among neighbors. The stark reality of Karen's actions shocked many who had initially believed her version of events. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Despite these small victories, Karen wasn't finished. She called a public HOA meeting, ostensibly to address community concerns. Flyers were distributed, and John found one slipped under his door. The language was inflammatory, accusing him of being a disruptive influence and urging the neighborhood to stand united. John knew this meeting wasn't about unity. It was another of Karen's tactics to vilify him, but instead of shying away, he decided to attend. Armed with Rachel's advice, Mary's videos, and his growing resolve, he prepared to confront Karen on her own turf. The stakes were rising, and John understood this was no longer just about a pool. It was a battle for his rights, his reputation, and his home. John entered the meeting hall with a steely determination, his shoulders squared against the palpable tension in the air. The room was crowded, with neighbors murmuring amongst themselves. At the head of the room stood Karen, exuding confidence as she prepared to address the crowd. John knew this was just another maneuver to manipulate public opinion and further isolate him. When Karen began speaking, her voice was dripping with authority. "Our community thrives on unity and adherence to our established standards," she declared, casting a glance at John. "Unfortunately, there are individuals who believe they're above these rules, disregarding the very foundation of what makes our neighborhood desirable." The murmurs grew louder as Karen launched into a tirade about John's supposed violations and his uncooperative attitude. She even waived copies of fines and notices, trying to validate her narrative. When Karen finished, John stood up, clutching the evidence he and Rachel had meticulously gathered. "You've all heard Karen's version of events," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Now, let me tell you the truth." He held up Mary's video recordings. "This is proof of what actually happened that day," he said, briefly describing how Karen had orchestrated the destruction of his pool using forged documents and misaddressed notices. Gasps rippled through the crowd as John played one of the videos showing the workers pouring cement while Karen directed them. Karen tried to interrupt, but John held his ground. "These fines she's waving around, they're based on lies. My property is not under HOA jurisdiction, and the annexation documents she's touting, they list a completely different address." The crowd began to shift, some visibly angered by Karen's actions, but John didn't stop there. He described how Rachel's investigation had uncovered a pattern of Karen abusing her power, targeting homeowners who challenged her authority. By the end of the meeting, the room was buzzing with anger, not at John but at Karen. The following week, Rachel filed a lawsuit against Karen and the HOA on John's behalf. The claims included property destruction, fraud, harassment, and emotional distress. The lawsuit was backed by an impressive array of evidence: Mary's videos, forged documents, neighbor testimonies, and records of Karen's past abuses. Rachel worked tirelessly to prepare for court, leaving no stone unturned. She subpoenaed HOA financial records, uncovering irregularities that hinted at Karen misusing HOA funds for her personal vendettas. She also identified former homeowners who had been forced out by Karen's excessive fines and harassment, building a compelling case of systemic abuse. John was nervous as the court date approached, but Rachel reassured him. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, "and Karen's arrogance will be her undoing." John had transformed from a man blindsided by injustice into a determined plaintiff ready to fight for his rights. This was no longer just about a pool. It was about holding Karen accountable and restoring the dignity of his home and his neighborhood. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as John sat at the plaintiff's table beside Rachel, his attorney. Across the room, Karen exuded a defiant confidence. Flanked by the HOA's legal team, the trial had drawn significant attention, not just from John's neighbors, but from surrounding communities that had heard whispers of Karen's overreach. This wasn't just a case about a pool. It was shaping up to be an exposé of unchecked power. Rachel opened the proceedings with a powerful statement. "This case is about more than one man's pool. It's about abuse of power, fraud, and a pattern of intimidation that no homeowner should ever face. Today, we will show that the HOA, under Karen's leadership, acted not just negligently, but maliciously." The first piece of evidence presented was Mary's video footage. The court watched as the screen displayed Karen standing authoritatively in John's backyard, orchestrating the workers as they poured cement into his newly built pool. Mary's voice could be heard in the background, pleading with the workers to stop, while Karen dismissed her with a smug wave. The footage was damning, but Rachel didn't stop there. She called Mary to the stand, where the elderly woman recounted the events of that day in vivid detail. Her testimony painted a picture of Karen's arrogance and disdain. "When I told her John wasn't part of the HOA, she laughed and said, 'He'll learn soon enough who's in charge here,'" Mary testified, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. Karen's attorneys tried to discredit Mary, suggesting she was misinformed or biased, but Rachel countered by presenting the misaddressed demolition notices, emphasizing Karen's failure to ensure legal due process. "The defendant didn't even bother to send these notices to the correct address," Rachel argued. "This was not an oversight. It was a calculated attempt to prevent Mr. Smith from defending his property." Next came testimony from neighbors who had suffered under Karen's leadership. A young couple described being fined thousands of dollars for planting flowers that weren't approved by the HOA. Another neighbor recounted threats of foreclosure over a minor fence repair delay. Each story revealed a pattern of bullying and coercion, painting Karen as a tyrant who wielded HOA authority as a weapon. Karen's legal team struggled to rebut the mounting evidence. They claimed she was simply enforcing community standards, but their arguments crumbled under the weight of Rachel's meticulous presentation. The forged annexation documents were the final blow. A handwriting expert testified that John's signature on the HOA membership agreement had been falsified, tying Karen directly to the fraudulent paperwork. By the time Karen herself took the stand, her confidence had evaporated. Under cross-examination, Rachel systematically dismantled her defense. "Ms. Karen," Rachel began, holding up the HOA's bylaws, "can you point to where it states that your jurisdiction extends to properties outside your recorded boundaries?" Karen faltered, flipping through the document in vain. When Rachel pressed her about the forged documents, Karen stumbled over her responses, offering vague excuses that only further implicated her. "You forged these documents to assert control over a property you had no right to govern, didn't you?" Rachel asked firmly. Karen's silence spoke louder than any denial. The final nail in the coffin came when Rachel presented the HOA's financial records. They revealed that Karen had used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including legal fees to fight homeowners who resisted her authority. The jury sat in stunned silence as Rachel outlined the extent of Karen's corruption. In her closing statement, Rachel left no room for doubt. This case is about standing up to unchecked power. The evidence has shown that Karen and the HOA acted not just unlawfully, but unethically, betraying the trust of this community. Justice demands accountability. As the trial concluded, John felt a surge of relief. The truth was out, and Karen's reign of intimidation was crumbling before his eyes. The jury's deliberation was swift, and when they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. The court awarded John substantial damages and ordered the HOA to cover the cost of rebuilding his pool. But the most satisfying moment came when Karen was led out of the courtroom, her arrogance replaced with the realization of her downfall. The courtroom's verdict sent shockwaves through the community, and the aftermath of Karen's downfall brought swift changes to the neighborhood. For years, her authoritarian leadership had gone unchecked, but now the full scope of her actions was laid bare. The HOA was left in disarray, forced to reckon with the consequences of Karen's corruption and the damage it had caused. The first order of business was restructuring the HOA itself. Under court orders, Karen was permanently barred from holding any leadership position within the HOA or any similar organization. Several other board members who had either supported or turned a blind eye to her actions were pressured to resign. A temporary board was established, composed of neutral parties, including a local attorney appointed by the court to oversee operations. As the new board began its work, they implemented sweeping reforms to ensure transparency and fairness. The arbitrary fines and excessive regulations Karen had championed were abolished. Homeowners who had been unjustly penalized were refunded, and a new system for community governance was drafted. This time, the HOA's focus shifted toward collaboration and respect for individual property rights. Neighbors who had once been divided by Karen's manipulations began to come together. At first, some were hesitant to approach John, ashamed of how easily they had believed Karen's lies. But one by one they came to him, offering apologies and gratitude for standing up against her tyranny. Mary, whose testimony had been pivotal in the trial, became something of a community hero herself. Many neighbors openly thanked her for her courage in recording the demolition and for supporting John when few others did. As for John, his home was no longer a battleground, but a symbol of resilience. With the HOA ordered to rebuild his pool at their expense, he watched as the construction unfolded, this time with his full oversight. The new pool wasn't just a replacement, it was a statement that his hard work and dreams couldn't be destroyed by someone else's arrogance. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood took on a different energy. Block parties and community gatherings, once dominated by Karen's rigid rules, became genuine celebrations. People began to see each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors who had endured a difficult chapter and come out stronger. For John, the most rewarding change was seeing his neighborhood thrive without the shadow of Karen's control. His decision to fight back had restored his peace of mind and sparked a transformation in the community. It was no longer just a place to live, it was a home. As John sat by his newly rebuilt pool, the warm glow of the setting sun reflecting off the water, he finally felt a sense of peace. The fight had been long and grueling, but the outcome had restored more than just his property. It had reaffirmed his belief in standing up for what was right. He watched his children play on the patio and heard the faint sounds of laughter from a nearby gathering of neighbors. It was a stark contrast to the tension and isolation he had felt only months ago. The battle with Karen and the HOA had been more than a personal struggle. It had revealed the strength of resilience and the importance of community. John reflected on the lessons he had learned. Never underestimate the power of persistence, he thought. The HOA had counted on his silence and compliance, but by taking a stand, he had not only protected his home, but also inspired others to challenge injustice. Another key lesson was the importance of preparation and evidence. If not for Mary's recordings, Rachel's expertise, and his willingness to document every detail, the case might have ended differently. Always keep records, he reminded himself, because the truth matters most when it's clear and undeniable. Despite the hardship, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had reclaimed his peace and seen his neighborhood transform into a supportive, cooperative community. As a symbol of his victory, the pool sparkled in the fading sunlight, a reminder that no matter how dark the struggle, justice could prevail. He leaned back in his chair, allowing himself to relax for the first time in months. His journey had been one of perseverance, but it had also become a testament to the strength of standing firm against those who sought to undermine his rights. For John, this was not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of a new chapter in a home he had fought to protect and could now enjoy fully.